Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore, and I'm thrilled today to welcome Grafton Tanner for the launch of his new book, The Hours Have Lost Their Clock, The Politics of Nostalgia, out now from Repeater Books, in conversation with Jenny Odell. While we're eagerly awaiting the return of in-person events, virtual ones like the one that you're about to see continue to be a joy for us at Community Bookstore. So I want to give a very special thank you to our guests for joining us this evening and for all of you at home for tuning in. Now to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters. They cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat button through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book, which is of course very important. One caveat is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them quickly. We've also scheduled a whole host of fall programming for you at Community Bookstore, so do head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is next Thursday, October 21st, we're thrilled to welcome Benjamin Labatut for his National Book Award shortlisted novel, When We Cease to Understand the World, in conversation with Lawrence Weschler as part of a series of conversations for the Venice Architecture Biennale. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. Finally, we've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe settings. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, you can hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. Now a little about tonight's guests and we'll get started. Grafton Tanner is the author of Babbling Corpse, The Circle of the Snake, and The Hours Have Lost Their Clock. His work has appeared in The Nation and in the Los Angeles Review of Books. He lectures at the University of Georgia. Jenny Odell is a multidisciplinary artist and writer based in Oakland, California. She's the author of How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. She's currently working on her second book. So without any further ado, I'll hand it off to you, Grafton and Jenny. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Cool.
Cool.
Let me, okay, cool. So,
Hey,
yeah, good to see you.
good to see you as well.
Yeah, I am super happy to be talking about this book. I mean, we've talked about this already since I'm writing a book about time as well. So I feel like we're thinking through a lot of the same things. But I think that you probably came to it from a pretty different angle than I did. So I kind of just wanted to hear about how you arrived at this way of thinking about nostalgia, because you've written about nostalgia before in other books, right?
Yeah, it's been kind of like more of a peripheral focus for a few years now, even though it's shown up in previous writings of mine. And I wanted to write something that was a little bit more in depth and kind of go long on it a bit and understand the history of this thing that is often thought of as an emotion by some people and then thought of as a gimmick or a marketing tactic or a trick or like just a discourse. And I wanted to know really where it came from and what it is, and whether there really is more of it being felt today than ever before, or whether that's just, not true. So even though it was kind of like always in the background of my writings, I figured it was time to dedicate something fully to it. And that's sort of that was at least the impetus of writing it.
Yeah. So like, what was your sort of jumping in point? Because that's such a big topic.
I think it was the pandemic, actually.
Yeah.
Because I had been thinking about wanting to do something like do a book on like how different cultures and different groups and organizations use nostalgia in different ways. And it was just going to be sort of a collection of essays about that. And then when the pandemic happened and everybody got stuck inside and there were all these articles coming out about nostalgia. And I think obviously people were feeling it. I felt it, and even if you didn't feel it, you were bombarded on screens with reruns and old sporting events and things like that. So, the middle of 2020 was this strange kind of like non-period of stagnant, looking backwards. And then there were these like sort of these intense discussions on whether it was good or not. Like, is it okay that I sat and watched all the Mighty Ducks all afternoon, or is that, is that not good, And
Yeah.
yeah, it was like weird internal crises. So I think that was kind of that's what kind of kicked it off.
Yeah. I'm just curious, did you do any of that yourself?
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, I got my wife and I got stuck watching all like the ESPN had like all these like weird, like dodgeball, like all these weird, like old, like obscure sporting events. And what's another one? There's this thing called Slippery Stairs from like the 2000s, where there's this giant staircase they covered in like goo.
Oh my God, I've seen this.
Yeah, and you like try to run up it, and that was like on repeat, and it's obvious, like it's like of a time, like it's definitely from like 10 or more years ago. And so oh yeah, definitely indulged. ESPN.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I appreciate that you make clear in the intro too is like you're not vilifying nostalgia. Like you're just interested in it. Like you're both talking about how it gets marketed and sort of like put to nefarious ends, but also like ways in which it could be generative maybe, or could like help us think about the future. Is that something that you went into it thinking that you wanted to talk about it that way, or is that something that you sort of found as you were researching more about nostalgia?
Definitely found as I went about it, because I have had a critical stance toward the way the emotion has been used, in political discourse, on screens, and cinema. And it's a narrow understanding of nostalgia if you think of it as just what shows up in like Space Jam and Donald Trump, but that seems to be quite popular and shows up in our face all the time. And so that's what we associate with nostalgia. But I actually got to thinking about it in a different way by thinking about other emotions and researching things like anger, for example, where anger is oftentimes suitable and reparative and generative, as you say. And then other times it's really bad, where you could get really angry at a person and ruin a relationship or what have you. But anger is also, it fuels dissent. Much of my own writing is fueled in some way by kinds of anger, righteous anger, perhaps. And so if we define it as an emotion, it's kind of the same thing. And there are numerous examples, of ways in which nostalgia can be felt, and it's not like the end of the world or the end of the future or something like this. And I think, honestly, researching the book in the middle of the pandemic, going through like personal and social crises all at once, it's like the body can't help but feel certain things, and I felt it just as much as other people, and that's a very different usage of the emotion than something like Make America Great Again or something.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think I also really appreciate that there's like some part where you're talking about the fact that there's sort of like a two-way street, where like the way people, for example, like fans, right, like will sort of remake material, or people will sort of have a more active relationship to like nostalgic consumption of culture than simply just having things like beamed at them. So right. It can be, a little bit more nuanced. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I guess, I mean, that question kind of got at this, but was there something that surprised you, that was especially surprising to you as you were researching?
The history of nostalgia. So like lots of people, at least in like the mainstream press, will talk about nostalgia, how it used to be a disease and then it suddenly became an emotion. And my understanding was that the drift from disease to emotion happened like in like the this is some nerdy history stuff, like happened in like the like the 19th century or something, when and that's kind of when things started to change. But in the early 20th century, even by World War II, you still had psychologists talking about nostalgia as like a pathological thing. Criminal psychologists in particular were really interested in nostalgia in the first part of the 20th century as a reason for people to commit like arson, which is kind of strange. Yeah, and there's all this sort of like gendered and ageist language around who might be nostalgic and in need of correction, if you will, in the first part of the 20th century. So like young people, young women, criminals, and anyone who showed up on the psychoanalyst's couch around the 1950s. It's very much like there's still, even well into the last century, a distrust of this thing as pathological. And it really isn't until like around the bicentennial, like in the 1970s, when it starts to get decoupled from this pathological understanding. And as soon as that happens, it's like the marketers picked it up, and then the 1980s happened. So
Yeah.
that was extremely surprising to me. Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's like not as long ago as you would think. I'm also now wondering if that kind of makes a lot of sense, because there was some stuff that I was looking at for my own book where it seemed like the early 20th century was very much a time of like the rhetoric about everything is just infused with speed, right? It's like eugenics in particular. It's like who is going to make it into the future and who is left behind, or who exists outside of time, right? Like it's like the sort of the machine fantasy of humanity or whatever. And that kind of makes sense. Like if then nostalgia would definitely be seen as a disease. Like I'm just thinking about there's this book about personal efficiency that I found, where the guy who wrote it, he basically makes a distinction between active thought and passive thought. And his example for active thought is a businessman who's doing nothing, sitting at his desk, and then turns out he's been doing the most important work of all, which is like disrupting, right? And then that passive thought is like a young maiden who's like reading a novel and like staring dreamily out the window. Right?
Yeah.
Probably nostalgically.
Probably. Yeah.
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 And he's like, yeah. And then he's like, that's kind of thinking, but like not really. So
yeah.
yeah.
There's just a minefield of literature like that in those decades. I came across all this, like there was oh gosh, I can't remember. There's an article I read, and it cited a piece from the earlier 20th century that the writer basically said that with an increase in media technologies and communication technologies, nostalgia will actually go away, because then we'll be able to, communicate freely. And boy, that didn't bear out, obviously.
So it's like the opposite. Now you can, as you write about, like now you can find anything from your childhood pretty much. Like, and like, if you haven't, you just have to wait. That's what I feel. I feel like there were things in college that I remembered like from my childhood and they weren't online yet. And then I like tried again 10 years later and they were.
And they were, yeah.
Like everything will eventually end up online.
Yeah. Yeah. And there seems to be sort of like a steady sort of like the farther we go into the future, the more the more minute things from the more recent decades get mined. And so it's, we go from like obvious icons of the 1980s to really, really niche, weird things that only showed up for like a year or two in the 1980s. And those get, kind of rebooted into the present. But yeah, I mean, obviously media technologies didn't end nostalgia at all. As one of my students said recently, that's because social media, for example, gives a person proof of everything. And I was like, that's actually a good way to put it.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. And I mean, I feel like this kind of connects to, I mean, like for obvious reasons, I really love the part of the book about algorithms. Also, I just love the title Nostalgorithm so much.
Yeah.
But like, I feel like that also is kind of like, there's something, I mean, I don't know if you necessarily talk about it as like speeding it up, but there's like some kind of like really important relationship between nostalgia and algorithms and the way that things are served to you. based on preference, like things that you want to consume.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a few years because it started from just a general feeling of like the retro / nostalgic aesthetics of the past few years seem strangely inhuman. They seem like they were almost like focus grouped or something, or they were like determined by data only, almost like human beings didn't make. I write about, there's this Super Bowl commercial that aired a few years ago, and it's from like Walmart or whatever, and it's like all the old these old like characters from like Men in Black and Scooby-Doo and Ghostbusters and all the pop culture ephemera of the past few decades. And I mean, it feels inhuman. I don't know how it was hard to describe. I was like, this feels like an algorithm gave it to me, like the algorithm created the commercial or something. And I kind of thought about it more, and I thought, well, I mean, I did some research with for a piece I was going to do a few years ago that ended up not happening, but looking into like some research that was done about a decade or so ago about trying to figure out if popular music over the past few years has started to like sound the same. And these researchers were looking back to like decades ago, like the 1960s, and they determined that since the 1960s, pop music, in fact, has started to sound the same over several decades. And I just got to thinking about like, well, in terms of recommendation algorithms like Spotify, if it's recommending the same old stuff to us over and over again from the past, it all sounds the same, then the people who create music to be picked up by those algorithms and recommended to listeners are also going to make music that sounds like that. So it kind of maybe like increases the trend or something. And then I thought, well, is it the case that just by reducing an art form like music to certain variables that then algorithms, are able to pick out and then recommend to listeners, is that act itself a way of like kind of narrowing down styles? And that's what got me to think about nostalgia and algorithms, in that it's not even necessarily that the past gets recommended ad nauseum on like something like Spotify. It's just that it's kind of the same sounding stuff gets recommended. And there's a term, I forget who came up with, I write about it in the book, but it's like stream bait music on Spotify, which is music that is, it's like supposed to be streamed well. It's meant to sound a certain way so that it's legible to Spotify's recommendation algorithms. And if you listen to that stuff, a lot of it sounds very like retro. It's just kind of fascinating.
Yeah, especially 80s.
Yes.
What's that about?
I have this term in the book called retro bait, which is my idea for like any sort of nostalgic lure that like in particular like a tech company may use to try to get you to give up your data. So Instagram, early Instagram at least, was essentially like a retro bait platform in the sense that it allowed people to take really terrible photos on their old terrible smartphones with bad cameras and then put this nostalgic kind of filter on it, which nobody really does much anymore. But that was the lure at the time, is that you could like have your cake and eat it too. I could take my phone out and take photos wherever, but yet at the end result is I get to share and it kind of looks like a Polaroid or something. And it worked. It attracted tons of people to it. But retro bait also like shows up in music. There's a genre of music called, sometimes it's called synth wave, sometimes it's called retro wave, and it is like vaguely 80s sounding music. And if you listen to enough of it, it all sounds the same, but it's extremely popular on streaming platforms.
Yeah. And also I noticed that kind of music is tends to get talked about, at least among people I know, is like really good work music, which I think is very telling, right? Like it's always like good music for working, like, because it's not really something that you would sit and listen to. Not like to be all like, not to be like one of those people who's like, back in my day, we like listened to our records, but like, you know what I mean? It's like kind of like it's monotonous, like what you're describing. And like, because of that, it's like really amenable to like background music for work.
Yeah. It's like old music was kind of like some flute and like meant to kind of chill you out at work. Retro wave as music is meant to almost like caffeinate you and like get you amped up for climbing the corporate ladder or something, you know. It's also music that has been picked up by like far right groups and appropriated by Yeah. Like fringe right-wing groups. Yeah, it's like a dizzying array of subgenres like fascist wave and whatnot. And a lot of times it's wrongly thought to be like versions of vaporwave, but vaporwave is a little stranger, and retrowave is a little more like straight up the 80s trying to be rebooted completely. But yeah, it's popular among right-wing groups.
Yeah. Wow. That's so weird.
It's so weird.
Yeah. I mean, also I'm just thinking about like, I think I think I emailed you about this at some point, but like I went to this thing called the 90s experience. That's like it's kind of like an Instagram museum type thing. And it's it's the 90s. It's all photo backdrops. It's not even trying to pretend to, like an ice cream museum or something like that.
Mm.
And I went, and it was such a complicated experience because like I had walked past it so many times. It's near my studio, and I used to like joke like, oh, do they have a room about NAFTA? Like what is a 90s experience? Like what's going to be in there? And it was, it was like the Titanic, and I don't remember what, Simpsons stuff. You could take a picture on the Simpsons couch. And like I felt so weird when I was there because people were really enjoying themselves.
Mm.
And it kind of there wasn't the crowd I thought it was going to be. I don't know. It was just like, it made me feel so mean for like wanting to go there and like make fun of it, Yeah. And it was also very clear, like if you look at the comments online, people are like, everyone is like, great times reminded me of my childhood. Or like after this really tough year, it was like really nice to just like be reminded of my childhood. And I was kind of wondering if you ever had that, like while you were writing this, like did you ever feel like, I don't know, that kind of conflict about like sometimes people just want to turn their brains off and like listen to like retrowave or whatever.
Look, I'll do it. There are a few synthwave artists that I think are really actually kind of good, but then there's a lot that just kind of all sound the same and whatever. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a big difference between like, the 90s museum, which won't likely cause like total social devastation. I can't imagine.
Let's hope.
You know what I mean? Let's hope not. And something like, nostalgic, pleas for yesteryear made by like really heinous reactionary kinds of folks, and I just think it all depends on who is doing the hearkening back and who's using the emotion and in what way are they doing it, and if it's to support structures of power that are exploitative, and that's not good. But that could be any emotion. That could be anger. I mean, think about any infotainment that is on primetime TV or not, that uses anger to try to stoke and fear also to stoke, viewers to, accept kind of ridiculous ideological ridiculous ideologies and support ridiculous people. And so nostalgia is one of those emotions that gets used. And I have my own, I'm sitting next to my 40-year-old synthesizer that I got because I wanted to make,
Nice.
like old synth music, because I like that stuff. But, it's everything's kind of within these networks of power, and we have to kind of figure out, who's benefiting from it.
Yeah. Right. I think I wrote this down that you write which paths are we consuming and who benefits from the consumption. Like, I feel like that's a pretty important way of framing it. Yeah. So, okay. So I also wanted to ask you about green nostalgia. I should say there's many different flavors of nostalgia in this book, which is another really nice thing. Yeah. It's not one big monolithic. Because I feel like you set it up in the beginning. It's sort of it's neither good nor bad on its own, but then there's also these many different kinds of nostalgia.
Yeah, I'm really like the tendency over the past like 20 years or so, at least since Svetlana Boym wrote The Future of Nostalgia, which is still just like, I think one of the authorities and just an excellent book. And she rightly talked about two tendencies of nostalgia. One of them is a little more reactionary, one is less so, one's a little more ironic. But there's been work since then by, for example, Alistair Bonnet is one of these scholars who says, like these aren't really absolute types of nostalgia, it's more or less like different ways that just nostalgia gets used. Like, different discourses of nostalgia, not absolute types. And even Boehm in the book, she doesn't really say there are types or just tendencies. Anyway, so different shades, different flavors, different ways it gets used. So I have 2 chapters in the book dedicated to what's happening with the climate, global warming, massive species extinction, and how nostalgia is just one of the many emotions that can be used to try to make sense of what's happening to the world and what's happening to the climate, and also to try to essentially neither throw in the towel on the planet or think that climate change isn't a real problem. And I feel like that if we look at what's happening over the last few decades with the warming of the planet, it's so extraordinary, and the future looks so much worse from our perspective that it can be really easy just to like kind of look backwards. And I think that that's one of the things that the writers of the Green New Deal were trying to do, is sort of like instill or induce this nostalgia for like the public works projects of the 1940s or something. And it, certain people, regardless of the nostalgic reference, still don't support it. But I think that green nostalgia, a nostalgia related to climate issues, oftentimes gets misconstrued as like a hippie chaining themselves to a tree or something, or like, Ted Kaczynski realizing his favorite natural oasis was paved over, and so he started bombing people or what have you. But it's much more than that. I think that one of the ways we can use nostalgia to think about climate and a future that's hospitable to multiple people, to as many people as possible, is by looking back and seeing that, look, I mean, like there was a time in which things weren't as heated as they are now, if you will. The world was obviously, I mean, even Tim Morton in particular has a specific date in which they say that like, this is when the world ended. And the steam engine was patented, and we started depositing carbon in the crust. They create this kind of like before and after period. And it could be easy to look back and go, well, things weren't as bad then as they are now. But that's sort of just only the first step. But I feel like that nostalgia is one emotion among many that can be used to kind of orient us toward the future, and try to fight for a more, a more egalitarian, hospitable world. And I also think that it's a better emotion than just a total nihilism to say like, well, there's nothing that could be done about the climate, and so we just need to suck it up and realize that we're doomed. I just don't think that's helpful.
No, definitely not. I mean, It's also making me realize that there's something about, that famous, the Walter Benjamin passage about the angel of history, with the debris of the past or whatever, that quote, like, I'm like, oh, the angel of history, like, is it nostalgic? because there's that line about it wants to like make the past whole again, right? Like, or it wants to like forestall the like storm of progress, right? And like, I guess from a certain point of view, like, especially from the point of view of like linear time or like linear progress, anyone who's looking backward appears nostalgic. In a way. Yeah,
even though like we know that progress narratives are extremely destructive, and have been used to justify all kinds of heinous things. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, and Naomi Klein writes about this in the end of This Changes Everything, and she talks about trying to like, harken back to the collective organizations of the past who, she said, like dreamed in public, and I think that that's to sort of yearn for that collective organizing spirit by looking back to the groups that came together in public and demanded a future worth living is absolutely a nostalgic gesture that I would endorse.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's reminds me a little bit of I just read the Dave Eggers like sequel to The Circle, where the company that's clearly supposed to be Facebook has merged with the company that's clearly supposed to be Amazon. It's a hilarious novel. I mean, like I was like laughing out loud, but I think I thought of it in the part where when you were talking about like thinking in the context of like big tech, like thinking back to a time when people were not as easily understood through data. There's a lot, I could see when I was reading that novel, which has so many like ridiculous things in it that either have ended up happening already or have happened or are clearly going to happen, that like one reading of his novel is like, oh, this guy is just like a grumpy holdout, right? Like being like very, you know, and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that even a person who's kind of against big tech could almost read it and be like, you know, get with the times, man, or something, right? But like there is something really important about him just sort of like putting his foot down and being like, and risking looking like that, to just be like, no, like I don't, like I see where this is going and I don't want it to go there.
Yeah, I mean, big tech is likes to use the language of futurity and progress, and even though their technologies like social media are obviously like engines of other emotions like nostalgia, backward looking emotions, but yeah, they are interested in offering up a vision of the future that they endorse, and no questions asked. And I think it's like, I'm nostalgic for a time before big tech, even though I know that the time before big tech was also had its own share of issues and problems. But I'm at this very non-nuanced point, where I just feel like the social media is the cons outweigh the pros. And I think that if we aren't resisting it completely, then they're going to kind of do whatever they want to do. And we know that they're right now trying to do, ridiculous, ludicrous, probably never to happen, ventures like the metaverse and socially behave, robots that police social behavior and whatnot. And these things probably will never come off the ground, or self-driving cars. But the fact that they do this, is just kind of outrageous. And it's simply because they just are, they can, there's no regulation on them, basically, at least in the United States. And I think that nostalgia is certainly a sort of kind of a resistive emotion to their blatant appeals to progress.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny because I haven't, I mean, I told you in the email, like I've been avoiding social media, and something that my boyfriend and I talk about a lot is like, there's certain friends that we can't get to sort of talk to us in other ways, like, because they're just in it,
Yep.
And I feel like in that context, it's like really important to like hold on to this memory of a time when like this was like not normal, like just to hold that in your mind is like there were these other ways of interacting, just to like hold that in the face of like something becoming very ubiquitous and unquestioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's kind of crucial at the very least to keep that in mind, because I mean, obviously there's a lot of experimentation and joy that could come from being in digital spaces, but there's a lot of terrible stuff too. And we kind of have seen it sort of play out over the past few years. I mean, before then, certainly it was being written about, but especially the last few years, and the last year, especially the pandemic, just how destructive these technologies are, and how they completely just kind of determine much of what we think and how we behave, simply because they have learned how to profit off communication. It's completely, surreal, dystopian kind of group of corporations we have here.
Yeah, totally. At the same time, you also have a part about escapism, because one reaction to that, which, I talk about in How to Do Nothing, is like, you could just go, I'm going to go live in the woods or whatever kind of mentality. But you also have a really great section on that and sort of approaches that people have taken that I really liked. Maybe you could talk about that.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, I think that nostalgia oftentimes gets thought of as just like simple escapism. And then the next step is that people will be like, well, what's wrong with that? And there really isn't anything wrong with that necessarily. I do have kind of a firm stance against people who exit from society completely, because I just don't think that it's a solution for anyone but the person who can afford the exit. And the people who can afford the exit are usually not always people like you and me. It's usually people who are able to, either financially or otherwise. I write about this. One of the more famous people who left to live in a cabin or whatever, like the dream, is this guy named Dick Prenneke, who in the 1960s, I believe, built this cabin in Alaska, and he wanted to, go live in it and get away from the world. He said modern society is terrible, and the news media is terrible. It's a lot of the same stuff we say today. And I'm going to go live in this cabin and forget you guys. I'm out of here. And he did that. He lived there for decades. He was only able to do it though because he had a buddy who would fly in all this food for him, like all the time. So he never really had to live off the land necessarily. He just kind of lived and had this bush pilot fly in food every so often, fly in books and give him company. And without him, I don't know if it would have worked. It would have worked out. And I think this idea of total escape is what allows situations like that to happen for us years later to look at it and go, well, obviously it wasn't totally total. But I don't think that the conversation about totally escaping is really very productive at all. I think that people need escape every now and then. They need to be able to get away. And return obviously would be nice as well, because it's the people who observe kind of a problem with the world to the extent that they say they want to leave. I think those people are really valuable because they're able to kind of see from a little bit of a distance and make a criticism. But, it's not very much of a heuristic move to just go and escape completely. And in fact, complete escape really isn't even possible. So the criticism of it is always going to be like mine, which is, well, somebody help this person out, or they've got, tons of money so they can go off the grid. And I honestly just love the concept you have in How to Do Nothing about standing apart, which is sort of a way to distance yourself from the world without having to fall prey to this idea of completely escaping it, which is ultimately impossible except for the ones who can really afford to do it.
Yeah, right. And I mean, not to mention, I think that contains its own nostalgia, right? There's you talk about the sort of lumberjack thing that happened. I don't remember what year that was, but the lumberjack hipster thing. But that move to want to go live in, it's like cabin porn, right? That whole, aesthetic, which when I was doing some research, I was really surprised to find how old that is. There's all these, I feel like right before the turn of the century, there was this, I don't even know if there's a name for this movement, but there was a very similar thing that happened where there were magazines and stuff of people really romanticizing an American sort of outdoorsman, very, very white, very male, kind of yeah, it was a lumberjack thing. It was just the older version of it. That I think was kind of supposed to be counterposed to a lot of anxieties, racial anxieties, but also anxieties about industrialism and being weak and immigrants and all of this, right? So it's kind of interesting to sometimes when you look through those magazines, it's the fonts are older, but it really looks about the same, in terms of the thing that's being sold is independence, which is impossible, but that's how it's you could live off the land and not need anyone else, and so I just think, and then there were a lot of physical sort of bodily standards that came with that, that are really morbidly fascinating, contests to send in your measurements for the world's most perfect man, crazy stuff. But that, so there was a nostalgia even then, and but something, and I wanted to ask you about this, if you ever sort of came across this idea or have an opinion about it, because I was thinking a lot as I was reading your book, of the idea of the simulacrum seems really related, because it's at least my understanding, this idea, of an idea of an idea of an idea that doesn't really end anywhere. So like in contrast to what you were talking about with like being nostalgic for like these openings in history where things were possible, that's very concrete, right? Versus there's this nostalgia that like the example that I used to give my students was like the Disney castle, like the Disneyland castle looks a lot like this castle. Well, I would ask my students, like, what castle is that? What castle is that based on? And my argument was that it's like a very castle-y castle, like that looks a lot like King Ludwig of Bavaria's castle. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's called Neuschwanstein. And it looks like a medieval castle, but it's from the 19th century because he was super nostalgic for that kind of architecture. He was just like a very aesthetically nostalgic guy. So he made this very castle-y looking castle. And then other castles are based on that castle. But like there's no original castle.
Right,
you know what I mean? Like it just kind of like disappears into history. And like it seems like that's an important part of some forms of nostalgia.
Yeah, and that's very much Baudrillard and Simulacrum stuff, that there's no there almost, you know, there's no the copy is the original kind of idea. It makes me think about the Notre Dame Cathedral a little bit, which at this point has endured fires. I mean, itself was built as kind of a nostalgic gesture, and then has had parts of it replaced over time, to the point where it's like the metaphor of, like, I forget what it is, but the old ship that different pieces of it get
the ship
replaced.
of Theseus.
Yeah. Until it's is it the same ship? And it it reminds me of that as well. And Disney is good at this, and
very good.
Disney World, and Disney being sort of the corporation that kind of made the culture industry, the nostalgia industry, ultimately as it is today. When you start to follow back, like the images and the traditions and the things that we do and the icons and the symbols, and then you realize that you don't really touch bottom, or you don't really touch like a unique, authentic anything. It's what are called like invented traditions or what have you, and they just sort of reference a vague thing like a castle, and we don't know where they come from, and sometimes they just come from something like a Disney film, or something that was entirely just corporately made to sell something.
It's making me think of the part in Gia Tolentino's book about wedding stuff, which just like totally blew my mind, that there's like these things, because they always talked about as like timeless, right? Like a diamond is timeless, and like the white dress is timeless. And then she just tells you like when those things like, started being marketed. And it's like way more recent than I thought, and way more specific. It was just manufactured. And now it's almost like a corporate version of what you described with that guy who realizes that all of his memories are from photos. Like, or he doesn't remember things outside of those photos. That's the liner notes to the first Fleet Foxes record, which I remember getting that years ago, and Robin Pecknold, I believe, is the one who wrote it, writes these liner notes about something that I think everybody has kind of gone through and felt, which is that a lot of our memories come from home videos and old Polaroids and old photos and whatnot. And when we are faced with that, like material, the evidence, it's really shocking, because then you start to wonder, well, what memories are real and what aren't. And we have to understand that, like, that's just kind of how memory is. But so to some extent, the things that we do every day are just kind of like built upon almost like totally air. But some of that air is decided by people like Walt Disney or what have you, or whoever decides that a diamond means this thing, or that weddings are supposed to go this way. And I just think that sometimes we could just sort of unthinkingly go through these traditional motions and not realize that most of it is just essentially in service to some faceless company or some I
perhaps
mean,
something worse.
yeah, it's like I'm just thinking about the Facebook 1 year ago thing when they started doing that.
Oh
Or
yeah,
the
and
year or
yeah,
the other one, the year, I don't remember what it's called. Not year in review, but the one where they do a video and they have all your, and it's like really
yes,
cutesy and they have all photos of your friends and
yeah, and it's just a bot. The bot, it's just
yeah.
that just completely. Yeah, I think that's like the Time Hop app too. Like, this
Yeah.
happened 10 years ago, and those things are
Yeah.
just terrifying to me.
Yeah. Same. Very dystopian. Okay, we should go to questions. I will look at these. Okay, so one question is, if popular nostalgia is so recent, do you think it's a bubble that might burst?
Um, well, I'll tell you, I thought it was going to burst about 10 years ago when
Are you nostalgic for that?
no, no, I thought like, even, I remember when Taylor Swift released 1989, and I remember thinking, well, that'll be the end of that. Like she came out with this record. It was all, very synthesizers. That's the end of that. And then about a year later, Donald Trump starts talking about making America great again. And I was like, oh no, here we go.
Yeah.
So I thought it would, but honestly, I think if you look back over the last few decades, you can see that, even the 1980s were incredibly nostalgic for the 1950s. So, I think that I think the emotion will stick around, but its references will change over time, just especially as long as media companies know that they can like profit off their intellectual property from the past. Those things will just keep rebooting. There really is a nearly endless supply of popular culture that can be remade and rebooted. It's amazing, and they've been doing it for a long time. This is my most favorite example, and I keep bringing it up, and it's so stupid, but Rob Zombie is remaking The Munsters, and The Munsters came out in the 1960s. And I remember thinking, why are we rebooting The Munsters? Like, does anybody really care about it? Like, of course we're doing this now, some pathological symptom of our society, et cetera. But I look back and realized that The Munsters were rebooted probably every decade since it went off the air. In the 70s, in the 80s, there was a second series in the 1980s that ran longer than the first series. There was a movie, I think, in the 1990s. It tried to get rebooted again in 2012. And now Rob Zombie's doing it again. And so this is something that is been going on for a while. But I just would argue that it seems to be kind of the main way that the culture industry kind of makes its money today. But it's nothing new.
Yeah, and it's always going to be. It's safe, right? It's the safe thing. It's why we keep getting superhero movies, right? So
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, someone asked, can you talk a little about the title? I'm curious about the allusion to a temporal slippage.
That comes from, I first came across it in a book, I believe it's called Notes on the Death of Culture, and the author's name escapes me, but it was translated by John King, I believe, and it was the epigraph to that book by a poet named Vicente Huidobro, a Chilean poet, and the English loose translation is "The Hours Have Lost Their Clock," and I was trying to find where it came from in one of Huidobro's poems. And I spent a long time, and I contacted a lot of scholars of Chilean poetry, and we tracked it down. It doesn't actually translate completely to "The Hours Have Lost Their Clock." It translates to something more like "My watch has lost its time," or something, which is not quite as poetic, I guess, but in the original language, it is. And so that's where the title comes from. The meaning is, and I write about a little bit about this in the intro, which is that one of the reasons why I think we have so much of the emotional nostalgia today circulating in discourses and in culture, is because there seems to be a feeling, at least over the past decade or so, of what Douglas Rushkoff may call like present shock, or a post-temporality, or a feeling that perhaps time has changed in some way, and we experience it differently. One of the examples that I write about in the book is just like a year or two ago, I believe it was on TikTok, there was a trend of videos that were nostalgic for 2017, which I don't know about you, but that wasn't that long ago, and of course there are plenty of videos nostalgic for early 2020, either before the pandemic or even the early lockdowns. So there seems to be a weird, I'm sure that you're covering this as well in your own research and writing, but there seems to be at least a shift in the way that maybe we think about time. And there seems to be, at least in the era of Zoom and working from home, a shift in how we work according to time, where the old way would be like clocking in and clocking out at a certain time. And now, sort of, especially during the lockdowns and what have you, and working virtually, not having that kind of going in and coming home sort of thing, we're kind of like always on the clock now to a certain extent. So even though it feels kind of atemporal, that actually is what gives the clock its power in some way to keep us kind of always hustling and branding. So it's not that the clock time has disappeared or by any means, but that its invisibility is actually what gives it some kind of hold over most working people's lives.
Yeah. Okay, so this question is, nostalgia on the right seems obvious, but I'm curious about how it shows up on the other side of the political spectrum. Is there leftist nostalgia beyond the green nostalgia you mentioned, parentheses, and the cosplaying Trotskyists who show up to hand out newspapers at picket lines?
Interesting. Well, I write about in the book, I did two examples of, at least in political discourse on the right and left, of ways that nostalgia gets used in electoral politics. My example is, of course, Donald Trump in 2016, but even Joe Biden on the campaign trail for the election in 2020 used a kind of nostalgic slogan, and it's still kind of used today, which is "Build Back Better," which is sort of a twist on kind of a nostalgic twist, but the inclusion of the word better, of course, is keeping us sort of forward moving. And there was a lot of nostalgia for the Obama administration during Joe Biden's during his campaign. There was an idea that maybe if Joe Biden gets elected, and then we can return back to like the halcyon days of Barack Obama, which wasn't Donald Trump, but also we know the sorts of things that Obama did politically as well across the world and in the country. In terms of a leftist nostalgia, there are writings on what might be called like a progressive or a radical nostalgia. There actually is a book. I talk about Alistair Bonnet a lot. He's just an excellent scholar of nostalgia, and he had a book several years ago called "Left in the Past" about the politics of like radical nostalgia. And he's actually one of the main thinkers who said, what we may think of as like a reactionary nostalgia isn't completely reactionary. It's got flecks of progressive nostalgia in there as well, or the idea that an ironic nostalgia isn't reactionary. We know that not to be true either. But I write about in the book sort of the battle over the memory of Martin Luther King as being kind of like a battle over how one might be nostalgic for him. Every year around MLK Day, of course, you'll have certain, centrist elites who will use MLK as kind of like the exemplar, and this is the way that we should do protests. We don't. Black Lives Matter, they're in the streets. We don't want to do that. We want Martin Luther King, nonviolence, elocuting from the pulpit kind of thing. And of course, we know that that's what Cornel West would call like the Santa Clausification of, of MLK. And that yearning for MLK in a radical way would be to yearn for his fierce pacifism and anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and anti-capitalism. So in some way, the memory of this one figure is sort of, there's kind of just a battle over how one might not only remember him, but yearn for him. I also talk a little bit about, in the conclusion, about the people who search for the disappeared in Chile after the reign of Pinochet, and how many of them are driven by kind of like a restless nostalgia for closure, not just grief, not just anger, but also a nostalgia for kind of getting back to their loved ones, even though they know their loved ones have either been totally disappeared, or they've died, or they've been buried in the desert, which is what Pinochet's people said that they did. But still finding their remains would kind of like give them a kind of closure. And in fact, there is a documentary that came out about 10 years ago about a few of these searchers who kind of roam this desert in Chile looking for the loved ones. And the title of the documentary is called Nostalgia for the Light. And if you listen to their words, they it's almost like they can't come to terms with it. But of course they can't come to terms with what happened, because it's awful, and they weren't totally given the truth, by the Pinochet regime. And so what to us might look like this kind of unceasing nostalgia for a past that never existed, or a closure that might never come, is really just kind of their skepticism to accept these official statements from Pinochet as like total gospel, the official statements about the past as gospel. So, I think nostalgia can be used in a variety of progressive ways. It just so happens that the mainstream political and corporate discourses are all quite nostalgic and reactionary, but that's just one way that it's used.
Mm-hmm.
That was a long answer, sorry.
No, that's great. Okay, this will probably be the last question, which is a little bit long, but I'll read it. Do you think it's possible that we perceive the passing of time differently in the 21st century? I've noticed it seems like years go by faster and faster beyond just an effect of getting older. I've asked people of a variety of ages, from young teen to my 70-year-old mother, and everyone seems to feel this acceleration. Is it possible that the speed brought on by technological advance has changed how we feel time? For example, what once was please allow 6 to 8 weeks for delivery has now turned into order in the next hour and get it today.
Yeah, well, that's definitely a shift. And we could, thank Amazon for that, of course. But I write about in the book about the 2010s as being a time in which it seemed like time kind of stopped, at least in terms of politics and culture, and that it was very shocking that we were witnessing these really heinous ideologies kind of percolate into the present from the past. And I believe it was Maximilian Alvarez who wrote this piece in the Baffler in 2016, kind of excoriating these folks who would say, this is 2016. What are we like? Why do we have these totally heinous things being talked about? This is the future, right? And he just kind of comes along and says, like, who told you that we had progressed past all of these issues?
Yeah.
And so in some ways it kind of seems like that, or it seemed like over the past few years, that politics and culture and the same movies and reboots and all of this have just kind of flattened out, and that the only thing that seems to be keeping us chronologically is technology at this point. And big tech knows this, and they like to remind us every year we have a new smartphone with a new higher number. And when, so it can kind of seem like that history has kind of accelerated to this point, whereas Byung-Chul Han says it's kind of splintered into pieces at this point. So I do believe that there's a shift in the way that we are experiencing time, and I think it has a lot to do with the technologies that we use. And I touch on it a bit in the book, but honestly, I think that the book that everyone has to read about time is going to be yours, Jenny. So.
Yeah, well, it's taking a really long time to write it, so it'll be out someday. No, probably next year. But
okay.
I think that's the time that we have. So.
Yes, unfortunately, we do have to let everyone go to bed at some point. But this has been a really fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed listening to it. So thank you so much, Grafton and Jenny, for joining us, for talking about this. Grafton, congratulations on the book. Jenny, we're waiting for the next one. Those of you at home, thank you so much for tuning in. Please do consider purchasing a copy of The Hours Have Lost Their Clock from Community Bookstore. We hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Take care, everyone.